I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Gertrude Polk Brown Lecture Series featuring author Garrett M. Graff and his latest book, Watergate, A New History. Now, I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker. Garrett M. Graff, a distinguished journalist and best-selling historian, has spent more than a dozen years covering politics, technology, and national security. Today, he serves as the Director of Cyber Initiatives for the Aspen Institute and is a contributor to Wired, CNN, and Politico. He's written for publications from Esquire to Rolling Stone to the New York Times and edited 2 of Washington's most prestigious magazines, The Washingtonian and Politico. Graff is the author of multiple books, including The Threat Matrix, the national bestseller Raven Rock, and the New York Times bestseller The Only Plane in the Sky. We will take questions at the conclusion of this lecture as time permits. There are 2 microphones at the foot of the stage for our in-person attendees. And if you're joining us virtually, please submit your questions in the chat. The author will be signing and selling books immediately following the lecture in the side lobby. Thank you again for joining us tonight.
Good evening. Thank you so much for joining tonight in this incredible space here in Louisville. I'm honored to be part of the lecture series with the Filson, and my thanks to Carmichael's for doing book sales tonight. It's one of the great parts of doing a book tour is the chance to get around the country and see the incredible independent bookstores that are thriving in so many corners of the country. So, Watergate. If you are like most of the people that I've talked to about this book over the last 3 years, you are sitting there wondering what more is there to say about Watergate. And the answer in my topic of the talk for the next hour here is actually a lot. My interest in this subject grew out of the work that I had been doing over the last 7 or 8 years in my day-to-day journalism, covering the Trump administration, covering Robert Mueller and the Russia investigation. As Patrick just mentioned, one of my previous books, The Threat Matrix, was actually the story of Robert Mueller's time as FBI director after 9/11 and the way that the FBI had tackled counterterrorism. And so I was naturally drawn through all of that work and research into thinking about what it was like the last time our country confronted investigating a president. And that led me back to Watergate. And I am a child of the 1980s. I'm a child of journalists and writers, and so had sort of grown up with the mythology of all the president's men and the mythology of Woodward and Bernstein and Deep Throat, Hal Holbrook in the parking garage telling Woodward, follow the money. A quote, by the way, that I came to learn actually that Deep Throat never said. And in fact, no one said follow the money in the midst of Watergate. And one of the things that I sort of came to understand as I began to dive into this research was exactly that, sort of how much of the mythology that we have passed down in popular culture over the last 50 years about Watergate, about Nixon, about Woodward and Bernstein, actually turns out not to just be true. And that this book was an attempt to try to take everything that we have learned about Watergate in the last 50 years and retell the story with the benefit of all of that new information. And I think what you will find in the book is that this is not the Watergate that we thought we were living through from 1972 to 1974. And that one of the things I really tried to do in this project is redefine Watergate, that we think of the Watergate story as an event. It's the burglary, June 17th, 1972. We think from there of the story as sort of Woodward, Bernstein, the John Dean, the Irvin hearings, the Saturday Night Massacre, the tapes, yada, 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 Nixon resigns. But what we now understand is that Watergate was not an event, it was a mindset. And that actually what we lived through as a country during that time was that Watergate was a series of about a dozen interrelated but distinct scandals that unfold inside the Nixon orbit from 1968 right through his resignation in the summer of 1974. And that we now understand, for instance, one of the great mysteries that have sort of long dogged historians looking at Watergate, which is why Richard Nixon in the summer of 1972 didn't hang the Watergate burglars out to dry. Sort of why he didn't say, which was true, I had no knowledge of this. These were rogue employees, and I disavow and condemn their actions, and I look forward to my landslide victory in the 72 election. Because one of the things, of course, that is one of the ironies of Watergate ends up being that Richard Nixon wins in 1972 re-election by the largest landslide in American history, that he sort of had no need for the dirty tricks of G. Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, the Watergate burglars, and the White House plumbers. And so why didn't he disavow them? And the answer turns out to be this sort of first thread in reconceptualizing Watergate not as an event, but as a mindset, this deep, criminal, paranoid, dark, conspiratorial mindset that Richard Nixon brings to politics and that then permeates his campaign and his administration right through his time in the White House. Because the Watergate story doesn't begin in 1972, it begins in the fall campaign in 1968. This is, of course, the 68 campaign, Richard Nixon, the former vice president of the United States, running against the sitting incumbent vice president of the United States, Hubert Humphrey. Nixon is in the midst of this 68 campaign. Vietnam hangs over the entire country that year. Lyndon Johnson, broken by Vietnam, not running for re-election, convenes that fall the Paris peace talks with a hope to bring the Vietnam War to a close. Richard Nixon realizes that the end of the Vietnam War is going to be bad for him politically, that it's going to help Hubert Humphrey. And so Richard Nixon, working with his campaign director, John Mitchell, begins to interfere in the Paris peace talks, working with a Washington socialite and doyen named Anna Chennault. And this is a series of events that we didn't even understand took place until about a decade ago, when documents related to this were declassified for the first time from the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library. And that we now sort of see that the original sin of Watergate we didn't even understand until a decade ago. And that in the fall of '68, Richard Nixon, working with John Mitchell and Anna Chennault, tells the South Vietnamese government to stall the peace talks, to keep the Vietnam War going. And that he, Richard Nixon, if elected, will give the South Vietnamese a better deal than Lyndon Johnson's administration would give them. And the South Vietnamese do. they stall the Paris peace talks. And so to put a very fine point on this, Richard Nixon, as a private citizen, as a presidential candidate in the fall of '68, keeps the Vietnam War going for his own personal political benefit. It is as close to a credible allegation of outright treason as we have against any political figure in the 20th century. Lyndon Johnson, in the final hours of the 1968 campaign, figures out this treachery. The NSA is wiretapping the South Vietnamese embassy, and they come up with wiretap intercepts about this plot. Lyndon Johnson confronts Richard Nixon. Nixon disavows and denies the entire thing, and the clock runs out. This all takes place sort of Sunday, Monday before the Tuesday election. And by the time Lyndon Johnson sort of figures out what he wants to do about this, the election has happened, Richard Nixon has won narrowly, and Lyndon Johnson decides to bury the entire thing. He decides, for the good of the country, that he can't bring this treachery forward. And he classifies the documents and hides them away in his presidential library for 40 years. But Richard Nixon knows that Johnson knows, and that this becomes the Edgar Allan Poe telltale heart treachery beating away at the heart of Nixon's White House. And so we fast forward to 1971. Daniel Ellsberg comes out with the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers should be the greatest triumph of Richard Nixon's political career. There are 2 million words in the Pentagon Papers, and not a single one of them is Nixon. The entire Pentagon Papers are about the lies of the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, Richard Nixon's 2 sworn political enemies. And these should be sort of a moment of triumph for him. And yet he's worried immediately that if the Pentagon Papers have leaked, then the word of the Chenault affair will leak. And he becomes obsessed with the idea, this turns out to be, as far as we know, totally false, that there is a copy of the Johnson papers about the Chenault affair in the safe at the Brookings Institution, the think tank in Washington. And so in the summer of 1971, Richard Nixon is on the White House tapes ordering the only burglary that we ever know that Richard Nixon orders, which is not the Watergate burglary in the summer of '72, but the burglary of the Brookings Institution in the summer of '71. And it begins in motion this plot that eventually brings G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt into the White House orbit. They come up with a plan to bring up 5 Cubans from Florida that E. Howard Hunt worked with on the Bay of Pigs invasion when he was in the CIA in the early 1960s. 5 Cuban burglars from Florida who, if you know the story that we are telling tonight, might sound familiar as the burglars who actually do end up carrying out the Watergate burglary in the summer of '72. But Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt and others come up with this fantastical plan in the summer of '71 to firebomb the Brookings Institution. And they are going to outfit the Cuban burglars as DC firefighters. And they are going to purchase and equip a used fire truck as a DC fire truck. And then in the chaos of the firebombing of the Brookings Institution, they are going to send these fake firefighters into the fire to break into the safe, extract these Chenault affair papers from the safe at the Brookings Institution, and escape with these papers amid the chaos of the firefighting efforts. Now, the plot falls apart, not because you might be thinking someone says this is a terrible idea that should have nothing to do with the White House. This is a ill-conceived and haphazard plot that should be kept far away from the president. It falls apart because Richard Nixon's campaign and the White House end up being too cheap to buy the fire truck. But it has created, in the White House, this plumbers unit of E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, and others, and this set of Cuban burglars who go on to do a series of other break-ins and dirty tricks heading into that fall, first targeting Lewis Fielding's office, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, in California, where they attempt to break in and steal his files there, and then, of course, go on to do the dirty tricks of the 72 campaign. And so what we now understand is that the reason that Richard Nixon can't hang the burglars in the summer of 72 out to dry is that when you start pulling on that thread, it unravels all of these other schemes back to eventually the Chenault affair in the fall of 1968. That basically, the problem that Richard Nixon has by the summer of 1972 is that there are so many crimes and so many conspiracies underway inside his White House that he doesn't actually know how to come clean about any of them. The second big thing that we sort of now understand about Watergate that we didn't understand at the time is, of course, the identity of Deep Throat. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up with that mythology of Deep Throat, of Hal Holbrook in the parking garage, and sort of this idea that we had for 30 years that Deep Throat was some Nixon insider disgusted with the corruption that he saw in the Oval Office, who was out there fighting with Woodward and Bernstein for sort of truth, justice, and apple pie, protecting American democracy against the most corrupt man who had ever been in the White House. That's actually not who Deep Throat turns out to be at all. That we now understand, as of 2005, that Deep Throat was the number 2 at the FBI, an official named Mark Felt. And that actually almost all of us have worked with Mark Felt over the years. He wasn't out there fighting for democracy. He was the embittered guy who didn't get the promotion that he thought he deserved, and then dedicated the rest of his career to sinking the guy who got the job that he think he deserved. We all know this guy from an office. Actually, Mark Felt in the fall, in the summer of 1972, was, he thought, the heir apparent to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. He had risen through the bitter knife-fighting succession politics inside the FBI to be the last man standing as J. Edgar Hoover's deputy. He anticipated that whenever Hoover left after his half-century leading the Bureau, that he would be the next director. And then in May 1972, J. Edgar Hoover dies in his sleep overnight. And Mark Felt wakes up with the news, anticipating that he will be the new director. And then Richard Nixon, 6 weeks before Watergate, does the unthinkable and appoints not Mark Felt, but another Nixon loyalist named L. Patrick Gray. And Mark Felt decides he's going to make it his personal mission to sink Pat Gray. 6 weeks later, the Watergate burglary happens. And Mark Felt starts leaking to journalists all of the different ways that Pat Gray is screwing up the investigation at the Watergate. He starts out leaking to Sandy Smith, a reporter at Time magazine, sort of one of the best sourced reporters on the law enforcement beat in the country. His first handful of scoops go to Sandy. Then he starts leaking to the Washington Post's crosstown rival, the Washington Daily News. In the middle of July 1972, the Washington Daily News goes out of business amid the newspaper wars of the 1970s. And then, and only then, in August, does Mark Felt sit down with a young reporter at the Washington Post named Bob Woodward and begins to work out a deal where Woodward will become the source of his leaks. And so you're left with this sort of fascinating historical what if, that if the Washington Daily News had survived for like 2 or 3 or 4 more months, would any of us have ever heard of Woodward and Bernstein? Because one of the things that we sort of now understand is that Woodward and Bernstein matter, but not in the way that we think that they do. And that in fact, they were part of a constellation of about a half dozen reporters, along with Walter Ruggeber and Seymour Hersh of the New York Times, Jack Nelson and Ron Ostro of the LA Times, who keep this story alive, keep the Watergate story alive from the summer of 1972 through the spring of 1973, when Watergate begins to create its own momentum with the trial of the burglars, James McCord's famous letter, the resignations and firings of Halderman, Ehrlichman, John Dean, and John Dean's ultimate cooperation with prosecutors that launches, of course, his fame amid the Irvin Committee hearings. By the summer of '73, Watergate has a momentum that any one set of journalists no longer was needed, but that from that summer through that winter, it's these 6 journalists who keep Watergate alive, and that actually arguably none of the 3 biggest stories during that time about Watergate are actually written by either Woodward or Bernstein. That it's a Walter Ruggeber story at the New York Times that first pieces together the outlines of the burglars' financial ties to the Nixon campaign, a story that actually causes the Washington Post that August to reestablish its Woodward and Bernstein reporting duo, because by the middle of July of '72, the Washington Post had largely decided that the story was over. And Carl Bernstein had been reassigned back to the Virginia desk, and Bob Woodward went home to Michigan for his summer vacation, where his father, a conservative Republican, spent the summer vacation lobbying Woodward to vote for Nixon's reelection that fall. Then over the course of that fall, you actually have Ron Ostro and Jack Nelson's story in the LA Times in October about the existence of Al Baldwin, the burglary lookout who tells his story in the first person in the LA Times, and sort of for the first time ties the burglars directly to the campaign hierarchy. And then, of course, it's Seymour Hersh's reporting in January 1973 that establishes for the first time that the Nixon campaign had been paying hush money to the burglars. And so you sort of have this team of reporters who keep this story alive, Woodward and Bernstein, helped all along by Mark Felt. But now that we know Mark Felt, we sort of have there are these incredible moments in that fall and winter that we see how little Mark Felt actually cares about Richard Nixon at all. And that actually, in key instances, he knows damaging information about Richard Nixon and the Watergate cover-up that he doesn't bother to tell Woodward, Bernstein, Sandy Smith, or any of the other reporters he's leaking to, because to him, he doesn't really care about Richard Nixon. He is only passing along the information that might sink Pat Gray, that might undermine Pat Gray's chances to stay on as director, with Felt's ultimate hope of usurping that position and taking his job as FBI director. And these sort of moments have really, again, only come together in the last couple of decades, and they help to change our perception and our understanding of Watergate in ways big and small. And it all merges with this dark, criminal, paranoid, conspiratorial mindset that Richard Nixon brings to politics and daily life. And it ultimately becomes the tragedy, of course, of Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon, by almost any stretch of the imagination, by almost any measurement that we would give, stands as one of the most consequential presidents of the 20th century. This is a man who, from 1952 to 1972, is on the national presidential ticket for the Republicans 5 times, a record equaled in American history only by FDR himself. In an era where news magazines dominated the American political landscape, Richard Nixon is on the cover of Time magazine more than any other human. A total of 55 Time magazine covers over the course of his career, more than a year's worth of news magazine covers. Richard Nixon is the president who winds down and ultimately ends the Vietnam War, after, of course, we now understand he keeps it going for 6 additional years. Richard Nixon ends the draft. He turns the all-volunteer army, it turns the military into an all-volunteer force. He battles inflation. He moves America off the gold standard. He signs Title IX. He signs legislation creating the EPA and OSHA. He brings more than 1,000 women into the middle management ranks of the federal government. He brings the first female military aides to the White House. He brings détente with the Soviet Union. He's the first president to visit Moscow, the first president to visit Beijing as part of his historic reopening of China. He is the first president to visit a communist bloc country in the Cold War. All of these accomplishments, though, end up being overshadowed by the single word that we now associate with him, which is Watergate. And sort of tracing how that paranoid, conspiratorial mindset undermines his presidency right from its earliest days, right from the campaign in '68, helps us sort of look at Richard Nixon in a new and different way. And that I think that this becomes a Watergate that is different than the story that we have handed down over the years, and different from the way that we sort of think about Watergate as this event that begins in 1972 with the burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters on June 17th, 1972. What we now also are left with are some of these incredible puzzles, these incredible mysteries, which is we still don't actually know, even 50 years later, what the burglars were actually planning to do inside the DNC headquarters that night. That the DNC break-in was part of a series of dirty tricks that G. Gordon Liddy had put together for the 1972 Committee to Re-elect the President, known as Operation Gemstone. And the origins of Operation Gemstone are sort of this incredible, amazing, sort of truth stranger than fiction story as well, where G. Gordon Liddy, remember, in his White House role with the plumbers in the fall of '71, is eventually sort of shunted out of the White House over to the campaign, where he is put in charge of dirty tricks. And in January 1972, G. Gordon Liddy goes to John Mitchell, now the sitting Attorney General of the United States, and proposes the dirty tricks that he needs for the '72 campaign. John Mitchell, of course, was the campaign director in 1968, is set to be the campaign director again in '72, and so is sort of running the re-election campaign from the Attorney General's office in the first couple of months of '72. And G. Gordon Liddy comes into the Attorney General's office with John Dean and Jeb Stuart Magruder, and a series of sort of floor charts that Gordon Liddy has had the CIA draw up. He understands that you can't sort of go down to your neighborhood Kinko's to print out your nefarious plot to undermine the Democratic Party, and so he turns instead to the CIA. And brings these charts for Operation Gemstone into the John Mitchell's office, and then proceeds to walk Mitchell and Dean and Magruder through the plot. And there are all of these subplots of Gemstone, each of them named for a gem. So there's Operation Ruby, Operation Sapphire, Operation Opal, sort of et cetera, et cetera. And it is this fantastical set of ambitious dirty tricks. It is not just a series of break-ins of Democratic Party offices. It is outfitting a spy plane that is going to follow the Democratic nominee around the country, city to city, and execute dirty tricks and spy operations at each and every campaign stop that the Democratic nominee is holding. It's a series of plans to kidnap key anti-war activists, drug them, and take them to Mexico for the duration of the Republican convention to ensure that the Republican convention is not disrupted by anti-war protests a la Chicago '68 in Chicago. And it's a series of plans to disrupt the Democratic National Convention in Miami, including renting a houseboat in Miami Harbor, outfitting it with audio and video surveillance, and assembling a team of high-priced call girls who are going to lure Democratic officials back to this wired houseboat and have them confess the secrets of the party in flagrante on tape. Add to that sort of a bunch of run-of-the-mill dirty tricks, and at the end of the presentation on Operation Gemstone, John Mitchell, the sitting Attorney General of the United States, does not say to G. Gordon Liddy, "Gordon, this is one of the most illegal schemes I've ever heard in my life. I'm going to have the FBI agents standing in my reception arrest you on your way out the door." He takes the pipe out of his mouth and says to Gordon, This is a bit more expensive than I was planning. Would you mind coming back in a couple of weeks with something about half this size? And then when Gordon Liddy does, they sort of kick the can down the road again. And that ultimately sort of what ends up happening is that Operation Gemstone ends up getting approved in late March 1972 as sort of this drastically scaled back set of plans, because no one will ultimately ever tell Gordon Liddy no. They just sort of keep saying, well, we're going to take a little bit less of this than you offered the last time. And so Gordon Liddy is left trying to carry out this ambitious series of dirty tricks without actually the resources that he had counted on. And so one of the things that we sort of now understand is that the Watergate burglary that we think of, that the burglary in June in 1972, actually is the second burglary of the Watergate. That team had actually gone in about 2 weeks earlier in its first attempt to install bugs and wiretaps on the DNC offices, but that they had screwed up and that the bugs weren't working correctly. And so that weekend in June, Gordon Liddy had brought the burglary team back to Washington not to burglarize the Watergate, but to burglarize George McGovern's headquarters and install bugs and wiretaps there. And while he had them in town, he decides he's going to go for a twofer for cost-saving purposes and have them burglarize the Watergate Friday night and McGovern's headquarters on Saturday. And Friday night, though, of course, they end up getting caught. But what they were doing there has never been entirely clear, because what we now see is that there are a series of competing theories about how much of it was a burglary, how much of it was a bugging and wiretap operation, which was surely part of it, and how much of it was actually an attempt to either cover up, or to discover the dirt that Democrats had on Nixon, or whether Nixon was looking for dirt on the Democrats. And there's sort of a variety of theories about sort of each of that, one of which is that what they were actually looking for that night were the Democrats' knowledge of Richard Nixon's other criminal scheme from the 1968 campaign, which was not the Chenault affair, but a sizable cash donation from the Greek military junta that he had illegally taken for that 68 campaign when he was in a cash crunch. That he knew, again, that Lawrence O'Brien and the DNC knew about, but he was worried in the summer of '72 that it might be weaponized against him in the re-election campaign. And what we sort of now see is that there were probably actually 2 or 3 different plots among the 7 people involved in the burglary that night, not all of which they actually told each other. And that there were sort of competing loyalties and conspiracies even within that team of the 7 burglars, the 5 burglars, and Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt that night. And you sort of find this almost in every corner of Watergate, where you have sort of conspiracies and crimes piled on top of one another in a way that it has taken us really 50 years to understand. So I think I might pause there and open it up to questions, and we can keep talking about this sort of fascinating series of political events that rewrote American politics. So I think that there are mics around the audience, but okay, great. House light's coming up a little bit. So questions?
Well, please come down, and we've got mics over here on both sides, so come on down. I'll get us started and start thinking a little bit about, you mentioned document declassification, and I'm wondering, from the perspective of the archive, about these lingering mysteries. Are there any documents that you might be waiting on to make their appearance in public? Or if anything should come, will it be sort of blindside us and we don't know that we don't know?
Yeah, so there's an obvious cop-out answer, which is, we have no idea what might come and what might tell us. I think the challenge is at this point, most of the remaining secrets of Watergate are not going to be written down. And that unfortunately we are at a time where enough of the key participants have died that probably we are, the mysteries that remain will remain mysteries. So, yes, sir.
I'm thinking that part of Nixon's problem is just the way he looked. And I think of Bob Dole has said that when describing Nixon, he said, hear no evil, see no evil, evil. Mm-hmm. So he had a reputation, even amongst his peers, and I mean, he just looked evil. He was perspiring, and comment on that.
Yeah, so it's actually a fascinating question, because what ends up, Watergate didn't come from nowhere. Richard Nixon's campaigns were dogged all the way back to his first congressional campaign with unusually active allegations of dirty tricks. He was famous for smearing opponents as communists. His campaign for Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas, who he called the Pink Lady, he sort of woke up every morning thinking that everyone else was out to get him, and that he needed to sort of give as good as he got. One of the things that we sort of forget about Richard Nixon is what an integral role he played in the Red Scare in American politics. That it was his crusade against Alger Hiss that becomes one of the defining moments, not just of his career, but of the age of McCarthyism. And that in many ways it is his virulent anti-communism that propels his political rise. This is a man who in 6 years goes from being a freshman member of Congress to being vice president of the United States, and really ends up on Dwight Eisenhower's ticket in 1952 because Dwight Eisenhower decides that he needs someone who is vociferously anti-communist to play to sort of that part of the Republican base. I mean, it says something about the state of American politics in 52, that Dwight Eisenhower, the man who commanded D-Day, the man who, was one of the nation's only 5-star generals in U.S. history, responsible for so much of the architecture of winning World War II, by 1952 is sort of insufficiently hawkish that he needs someone like Richard Nixon to sort of shore up his national security credentials. But that sort of straight through Richard Nixon's campaign, he has this air and sort of shadow of dirty tricks that dog him. And there's that great saying about just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not actually out to get you. There's some truth to this, of course, right? Like, Richard Nixon runs for president in 1960 and loses narrowly to John F. Kennedy amid what are actually, I think, some of the most credible allegations that we have that the election was in fact stolen from him by the Democratic machine in Illinois and elsewhere, and that Nixon ends up being driven by that sort of sense of grievance right through the 1960s, sort of the sense that he was never accepted by the New York elites. He was never accepted by, the Washington elite, that he was this, little kid from Whittier College on the, outskirts of the American empire in Yorba Linda, California, and that he sort of never gets the respect that he thinks he deserves, comes into the 68 campaign with this very strong sense that he's going to do anything that it takes to win, hence the Greek donation, hence the Chenault affair, and then very narrowly beats Hubert Humphrey. Sort of one of the things, of course, that we sort of forget as we look back on American history is that had the Paris peace talks succeeded in the fall of 68, Hubert Humphrey probably actually would have won. And so this all drives Richard Nixon coming into the 72 campaign as well, where he sort of feels like he's in a good position, but he had lost the 60 election, narrowly won 68, and sort of it wants to make sure that he does everything that he can, that he pulls out all of the stops and pulls out all the dirty tricks that he can to win in 72, thus leading to this incredible irony of sort of the one election that he didn't need any of the dirty tricks turns out to be 72 when he wins by this enormous landslide. So I think there's a question down here.
Hi. What's your opinion on what led Gerald Ford to decide to pardon Nixon? And I have a second question, too. Are you going to be writing a similar book about the Trump administration? Thank you.
Yeah, and those two questions, by the way, are not unrelated, of course, right? Like, I think that one of the things, Gerald Ford ends up pardoning Richard Nixon in the fall of 74, because Gerald Ford doesn't see how he can govern while the country is consumed with the investigation, indictment, trial, and possible imprisonment of a president. Gerald Ford sort of ultimately decides, that he can't move the country forward at all while there's this sort of shadow hanging over Richard Nixon. I think that, Gerald Ford was probably partly correct in his reasoning then. I think that there is a very different history of American politics over the last 50 years that unfolds if Richard Nixon ultimately is convicted and sent to prison in the 1970s. I think Iran-Contra ends up looking pretty different in the 1980s. I think the Clinton scandals end up looking pretty different in the 1990s. If there had been this overhang that, yes, we will actually send a former president of the United States to prison. That obviously has some, shadows and overtones about the moment that we are living through right now. And I think one of the things that we have come to understand about the era that we have just lived through is the same thing that we have now come to understand about Watergate, which is Watergate is an umbrella for this constellation of a dozen interrelated but distinct scandals unfolding from 68 to 74, but that there's sort of a straight line through all of these scandals, that there's a narrative that you can follow, that there's a thread of Richard Nixon's paranoid, criminal, conspiratorial mindset that drives and relates all of these various scandals, sort of no matter who in fact is involved as individuals. And I think we now can see Donald Trump's presidency as very similar, which is, it is all one story. It is not a series of unrelated scandals and actions, that there is a single narrative thread that runs from the Russian attack on the 2016 election, the Trump campaign's efforts, the firing of Jim Comey, the Mueller investigation, the efforts to obstruct the Mueller investigation, the Mueller report, which then, the morning after Mueller testifies in Congress is when you have the perfect telephone call with Volodymyr Zelensky, launching sort of the Ukraine scandal, which leads to the president's first impeachment, his initial attempts to undermine the legitimacy of his opponent in the upcoming 2020 election, and the ultimate attempts to undermine the legitimacy of that election afterward, the big lie, January 6th. And I would argue, the war in Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's invasion in February this year is sort of all the same story, right? And I think that, to me, as a historian, part of the challenge of writing a similar volume is we don't know the end of the Donald Trump story yet. We don't know yet whether we are in the beginning, the middle, or the end of the Donald Trump story with American politics. And that sort of the level of hindsight and analysis and the revelations that we have had about Watergate over the last 50 years allow us to understand that as a very different event now. And I don't think we have the hindsight yet to understand sort of where in the arc of this narrative thread we are in our current moment in politics. So, questions down here?
Yes. How much do you think Nixon knew about Agnew's issues, and did that add to his overall paranoia? And then in the course of your book, were you able to talk to Woodward Bernstein and or John Dean?
Yeah. So Spiro Agnew, this is the crazy part of the Watergate story, right? Which is Spiro Agnew, in the midst of Watergate, Vice President of the United States, is forced from office for a totally unrelated criminal investigation that, under sort of almost any other set of circumstances, would be one of the biggest stories in American politics, but is this really minor footnote to Watergate. That Spiro Agnew, Vice President of the United States, is accepting bribes in the White House compound. That actually, the Justice Department prosecutors, when they launch this investigation, end up being able to prove it really easily because Spiro Agnew is literally accepting cash bribes in his vice president's office, and the Secret Service takes really good notes of who walks in and out of the vice president's office. And so they have these incredibly detailed records of precisely when people show up to give Spiro Agnew bribes. And that this is all unfolding in the fall of 1973 as Nixon is already wrapped up deeply in Watergate, and leads to this, probably what is the wildest month in the history of American politics. Like, if you think the last 5 years have had some wacky moments, like, we got nothing on October 1973. Spiro Agnew resigns in the beginning of the month, pleads guilty to these criminal charges. The Yom Kippur War launches, leading to some of the darkest moments of the Cold War, some of the closest that we come to actual nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Richard Nixon has the Saturday Night Massacre amid the battle over his White House tapes, where he fires Attorney General Elliot Richardson, Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus. I mean, they both technically resign. Rather than fire Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, Nixon, then ultimately fires, ultimately gets rid of Archibald Cox, is in such a state amid this turmoil that he is drinking heavily and sort of largely absent from the US government's crisis response to the Yom Kippur War, such that one night Al Haig, his chief of staff, and Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor and then Secretary of State, sort of he was dual-hatted at this moment in American history, that they take the nation to DEFCON 3, one of the highest levels of military readiness that we were in the entire Cold War, without ever telling Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon is drunk upstairs in the White House residence in the wake of the Saturday Night Massacre, and that they sort of decide that, like, the next morning, when he wakes up, they're going to say, "Oh, by the way, we took the nation to DEFCON 3 last night while you were sleeping." And it becomes this wild month that, like, you would never be able to get a, like, House of Cards episode to capture, because no one would actually believe that you could sort of have all of this unfolding at once. And then to sort of quickly answer your second question, in terms of research, I actually decided very early on that I was not going to do original interviews for this book. That Watergate has been written about and documented enough that returning to people for their sort of umpteenth interview 50 years later, I don't believe that you're actually going to get, for the most part, honest assessments and recollections of what actually happened. Most interviews now are about sort of the way that mythology has overtaken the story, and sort of people are telling you the myths that they have told themselves and built up around themselves over the last 50 years. And there's sort of one great example of this, which comes back to All the President's Men, the movie. Jason Robards, who plays Ben Bradley in a way that, was literally better at being Ben Bradley than Ben Bradley was. As you may remember, in the movie, Jason Robards has this thing where he knocks his ring on the table when he's sort of trying to make a point in the story playing Ben Bradley. In the wake of the movie, Ben Bradley started rapping his ring on the table when he was trying to make points, and it was sort of only later that people pointed out to Ben Bradley, you never actually did that prior to the actor portraying you saying that you did that. And that what we've sort of seen over these last 50 years is sort of the way that these mythologies have sort of crystallized around around the story in a way that I sort of thought that the best value I could bring to this story was to sort of take the pieces of the story as they already exist and reassemble them in a meaningful way. And I think we have one last person and one last question.
Thank you for coming to Louisville. Somewhere recently, and I'm pretty sure it was in your book, I read that there was a Louisvillian who played is kind of now forgotten, I think his name was Michael McMinoway, who, was briefly a national character in the story. I think he was part of the dirty tricks or spying operations. Do you remember much about him? Can you talk a little bit about his role?
Yes, in the sort of vaguest set of terms, which is he was part of, sort of one of these subplots of Operation Gemstone, where the Nixon campaign ends up sort of putting spies into other people's campaigns, and into the Democratic campaigns. And they had sort of a whole series of them, including like a taxi driver who was like spying on Ed Muskie's campaign, some field workers who were like out doing weird, dirty tricks inside the Democratic campaigns to sort of undermine their campaign tactics, one of which was like they had a field operative who was in charge of phone banks who switched the scripts for the calls, and so everyone who was phone banking for black voters would get the script for labor union voters, and vice versa, would program the phone banks to place all of their telephone calls at 3 a.m., thus angering anyone who was actually answering their phone at 3 a.m., and was displeased to be getting a get out the vote call for Ed Muskie kind of thing. And again, like these were sort of all part of this like big sprawling vision for Operation Gemstone in 72, all of which ends up being unneeded. So
we have time for one question from the virtual audience.
Great.
This is from Richard Ober. Were any of these dirty tricks aimed at California Congressman Pete McCloskey, the Silver Star Marine who ran against Nixon in the 1972 Republican primaries on the anti-war platform?
I do not believe so, which is not to say that there weren't sort of spillover operations that might have targeted him, but Nixon was very confident in his own renomination process. And was, in 72, seemed like he was actually in a very strong position politically in America, which makes the ultimate tragedy of the dirty tricks that ended up unwinding him that year unnecessary. Because I think the oddity of all of this is that had Gordon Liddy not embarked on the Operation Gemstone and his dirty tricks and the plumbers and all of that, there's probably some other scandal that would have blown up, but there's a very high likelihood that Nixon would have served out the completion of his second term successfully and stepped down, in January 1977, and been seen as a very triumphal president. So,
Thank you.
Anyway, thank you to Filson, thank you to Carmichaels. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys tonight.